The neon lights of Detroit flickered like dying stars against the bruised sky, casting jagged reflections across the cracked pavement of Grand River Avenue. In the shadow of a boarded-up pawn shop, Malcolm "Mac" Jackson crouched beside an old oil drum, its rusted edges glowing orange from the fire he'd coaxed to life. His hands, weathered and scarred from a past he refused to speak of, stretched toward the flames, chasing warmth in a city that offered none. The army surplus jacket hung loose on his frame, its frayed cuffs brushing against jeans patched with duct tape. To anyone passing by, he was just another invisible man, a ghost swallowed by the urban decay of Michigan's fallen giant. But beneath the grime and the hunched posture, his eyes, sharp, unyielding, and dark as coal, betrayed a vigilance that never slept. The wind carried the faint hum of traffic and the distant wail of a siren, but here in this forgotten pocket of the city, the night was a symphony of silence, broken only by the crackle of burning trash. Malcolm poked the fire with a bent metal rod, his movements deliberate, almost meditative. He'd learned long ago that survival wasn't about fighting every battle. It was about enduring, watching, waiting. Across the street, the Blue Anchor Bar glowed like a beacon, its neon sign buzzing faintly as patrons stumbled out into the cold. Most hurried past the cluster of homeless folks huddled near the curb, clutching their meager belongings tighter as if the sight of poverty might somehow cling to them. Just another night, Malcolm muttered to himself, his voice a low rasp lost in the wind. Then came the sound he'd been dreading, the heavy thud of boots on asphalt, the sharp bark of laughter that cut through the quiet like a blade. Three figures emerged from the shadows of the bar's alleyway, their silhouettes framed by the flickering streetlights. Officer James "Jimmy" Russo led the pack, his broad shoulders squared beneath the navy blue uniform, blonde hair cropped close to his scalp. A permanent smirk twisted his lips, the kind that promised trouble and delivered it with relish. Behind him, Derek Walsh followed, thinner and wiry, his dark brown hair glinting under his cap as he matched Russo's stride with eager menace. Trailing them was Tommy Hayes, the rookie, his black hair disheveled and his eyes darting nervously as if he hadn't yet decided whether to belong. "Hey, look at this," Russo called out, his voice booming with mock cheer as he nodded toward a group of homeless men warming their hands by another barrel fire. "City's finest tax dollars at work, keeping these bums cozy." Walsh snickered, kicking at a discarded bottle that shattered against the curb. Malcolm didn't move, didn't flinch, but his grip tightened on the metal rod. He knew what was coming. He'd seen it too many times before. Russo's smirk widened as he strode toward the group, his baton swinging lazily at his side. "Time to clean up the streets," he said, and with a swift, brutal motion, he drove his boot into the side of their fire barrel, sending embers and ash exploding into the night. The men by the barrel scattered like startled birds, their hoarse shouts swallowed by the wind as Russo's laughter echoed off the brick walls. One of them, a frail figure wrapped in a tattered blanket, stumbled and fell, his hands scrabbling against the pavement. Russo loomed over him, his shadow stretching long and menacing under the streetlight. "What's the matter, old man? Too drunk to run?" he taunted, nudging the man's ribs with the toe of his boot. Walsh joined in, his baton tapping a staccato rhythm against his palm, a predator's grin splitting his face. Tommy Hayes lingered at the edge of the scene, his fists clenching and unclenching as if wrestling with an invisible chain. "Come on, Jimmy," he muttered, barely audible. "We've got reports to file." Russo shot him a glare, his smirk hardening into something colder. "Loosen up, rookie. This is the real job, teaching these losers their place." Malcolm watched it all from his corner, his fire still flickering weakly against the onslaught of the night. He didn't rise, didn't call out, but his eyes tracked every move. Russo's swagger, Walsh's eager cruelty, Hayes's faltering resolve. It was a dance he knew too well, one he'd seen play out in countless alleys across Detroit. The frail man groaned as Russo delivered another kick, this one harder, sending him sprawling into a pile of soggy cardboard. "City's going to hell with these parasites everywhere," Russo sneered, dusting off his hands as if he'd just finished a chore. Walsh chuckled, but Hayes looked away, his jaw tight, his gaze briefly meeting Malcolm's across the distance. For a split second, something passed between them. Recognition, maybe shame. But Hayes broke the contact first, turning back to his partners. Russo's attention shifted, his head swiveling like a hawk spotting prey. He zeroed in on Malcolm, still crouched by his drum, the lone figure who hadn't flinched or fled. "Well, well," Russo said, his voice dripping with malice as he started toward him. "Got ourselves a tough guy over here, huh? Sitting pretty by his little campfire." Walsh followed, his steps eager, while Hayes trailed reluctantly, his boots dragging on the asphalt. Malcolm didn't respond, didn't even look up, just kept poking the fire, the rod scraping against the drum's edge with a slow, deliberate rhythm. Russo stopped a few feet away, towering over him, his baton now gripped tight. "What's your deal, huh? Think you're too good to run?" he demanded, his tone sharp with irritation at Malcolm's silence. Malcolm finally raised his head, his dark eyes locking onto Russo's with an intensity that cut through the neon haze. No fear, no anger, just a cold, unblinking focus that made Russo's smirk falter for a heartbeat. "Just staying warm, officer," Malcolm said, his voice low and steady, a quiet defiance woven into the words. Russo's lip curled, but before he could act, his radio crackled with a dispatcher's voice, pulling him back to the patrol car. "Saved by the bell," he muttered, giving Malcolm one last glare. "Next time, you won't be so lucky." As the trio retreated, Malcolm's gaze lingered, memorizing every detail. The way Russo moved, the weight of his arrogance. This wasn't over. The air on Cass Avenue hung heavy with the stench of rotting garbage and exhaust, a gritty perfume that clung to the streets of Detroit like a second skin. Malcolm Mack Jackson stood near the back of a shuttered diner, its faded sign dangling crookedly above a dumpster overflowing with refuse. The fire from last night's encounter on Grand River still burned in his mind. Not the flames he'd tended, but the spark of defiance he'd felt watching Officer Jimmy Russo strut away. Tonight, he wasn't warming his hands. He was scavenging, sifting through the trash for anything edible, his movements slow and methodical. The city's neon glow barely reached this alley, leaving him in a pool of shadow, his silhouette a dark stain against the grimy brick wall. Footsteps echoed from the mouth of the alley, sharp and purposeful, cutting through the distant rumble of traffic. Malcolm didn't look up. He didn't need to. He knew the rhythm of those boots, the weight of authority laced with cruelty. Russo's voice boomed closer now, thick with mockery. "Back at it, huh? Digging through the trash like a damn rat." Malcolm straightened slowly, brushing a smear of grease from his hands onto his frayed jeans. Russo stepped into view, his broad frame filling the alley, flanked by Derek Walsh, whose wiry energy crackled like a live wire. Tommy Hayes hung back, his face half hidden in the dim light, eyes darting as if searching for an escape he'd never take. Before Malcolm could respond, Russo lunged forward, shoving him hard. The force sent him crashing into the dumpster, metal clanging against metal as he hit the ground, food scraps spilling onto his jacket. Walsh burst into laughter, the sound high and jagged, while Russo towered over him, his smirk twisting into a snarl. "You're starting to piss me off, staying quiet like you're better than us," he growled, cracking his knuckles. "Maybe it's time I teach you some manners." Malcolm stayed down, his breathing steady despite the ache blooming in his ribs. He didn't fight back, not yet, but his eyes locked onto Russo's, cold and piercing, cataloging every flicker of arrogance, every twitch of aggression. A new voice cut through the tension, sharp and defiant. "Leave him alone, you bastard!" Lena Carter emerged from the shadows, her small frame taut with anger. She was a wiry woman in her 30s, her dark hair pulled back in a messy braid, her worn coat patched at the elbows. Once an Army medic, now just another ghost on Detroit streets, she'd taken to watching out for Malcolm since he'd shared a scavenged meal with her months ago. Russo turned, his smirk returning as he sized her up. "What's this? Your little girlfriend come to save you," he sneered, stepping toward her. Walsh grabbed her arm, twisting it hard enough to make her gasp, but she didn't back down, glaring at him with fire in her eyes. Malcolm's voice broke the standoff, low and steady, cutting through the alley like a blade. "Let her go." It wasn't a plea, it was a command, laced with a quiet menace that made Walsh's grip falter for a split second. Russo spun back toward him, his amusement morphing into irritation. "You don't give orders, trash," he snapped, but there was a flicker of unease in his eyes, a crack in his bravado. Malcolm pushed himself up from the pavement, ignoring the sting of his bruised ribs, his movements deliberate as he brushed off the garbage clinging to his jacket. He didn't advance, didn't clench his fists, just stood there, his gaze locked on Russo, unblinking and unnervingly calm. Walsh tightened his hold on Lena, twisting her arm further until she bit back a cry. "Maybe we should teach her a lesson too," he said, his voice eager, almost giddy. Russo nodded, stepping closer to Malcolm, his baton now in hand, tapping against his thigh. "You've got a big mouth for a nobody," he said, raising the weapon as if to strike. But before he could swing, Tommy Hayes finally moved, his voice trembling but firm. "Jimmy, come on. We've got patrol. This isn't worth it." Russo's head snapped toward him, his glare venomous. "Stay out of this, rookie," he barked. But the interruption bought Malcolm a moment, just enough for the radio on Russo's shoulder to crackle to life, a dispatcher's voice calling them back to the precinct. Russo cursed under his breath, lowering the baton. "You're lucky tonight, bum," he spat, shoving Malcolm one last time before turning away. Walsh released Lena with a rough push, sending her stumbling into the wall, and followed Russo out of the alley, laughing as they went. Hayes lingered, his eyes meeting Malcolm's again, this time with a shadow of guilt. "Sorry," he mumbled, barely audible, before hurrying after his partners. Lena steadied herself, rubbing her arm as she glared at their retreating backs. "Cowards," she muttered, then turned to Malcolm, concern softening her anger. "You okay, Mac?" He nodded, but his attention was already elsewhere, his sharp eyes tracking Russo's path beyond the alley's mouth. As the patrol car's taillights vanished into the night, Malcolm slipped into the deeper shadows, moving with a soldier's precision. He'd noticed something, Russo breaking off from the others, heading toward a darkened corner near a pawnshop. There, under a flickering street lamp, Russo met a man in a hooded jacket, Marcus, a known dealer in Detroit's underworld. Words were exchanged, an envelope passed hands, and Russo walked away, oblivious to the ghost watching from the dark. Malcolm's lips pressed into a thin line, his mind filing away every detail. The time, the place, the quiet betrayal of the badge. This wasn't just harassment. This was a system, and he'd just found its first thread. The night pressed down on Detroit like a heavy shroud, the air thick with the promise of frost as Malcolm Mac Jackson sat beneath the skeletal frame of an abandoned overpass off Jefferson Avenue. The city's hum was distant here, muffled by the concrete pillars and the sluggish flow of the Detroit River nearby. He leaned against a rusted beam, his army surplus jacket pulled tight against the chill, staring into the small fire he'd built from scavenged wood and newspaper. The flames danced, casting fleeting shadows across his face, deep lines etched by years of war and survival, a map of a life he'd tried to bury. For a moment, the crackle of the fire wasn't just burning trash, it was the snap of gunfire echoing across a desert half a world away. His mind slipped back to Iraq, to a night in 2007 when the air had smelled of dust and blood instead of diesel and decay. He'd been Master Sergeant Malcolm Jackson then, a sniper with a reputation that made enemies tremble and allies breathe easier. The mission had gone sideways, an ambush in a narrow valley near Mosul, their convoy pinned down by insurgents. General Arthur Grayson, then a colonel, had been trapped behind a wrecked Humvee, his leg torn open by shrapnel, barking orders over the radio as bullets chewed the sand around him. Malcolm had perched on a ridge a mile out, his scope trained on the chaos below, his breath steady as he counted heartbeats between shots. 7 kills, 7 precise pulls of the trigger, had silenced the enemy fire, giving Grayson and the unit a chance to pull back. He'd hauled the colonel over his shoulder, ignoring the burn of his own grazed thigh, and carried him 2 miles to safety through a storm of dust and death. The memory jolted him back to the present, the fire's warmth, a faint echo of that desert heat. He flexed his scarred hands, feeling the phantom weight of the rifle he hadn't touched in years. That man, the soldier who'd saved lives with cold precision, was a ghost now, hidden beneath the grime of Detroit streets. Here he was just Mac, the quiet drifter who kept to himself, who didn't fight back when men like Russo pushed him into the dirt. He'd chosen this life, or it had chosen him. After the war spat him out with nothing but medals he couldn't eat and nightmares that wouldn't fade. Footsteps crunched on gravel, pulling him from the past. Lena Carter approached, her coat bundled tight, carrying a battered thermos she'd scavenged from a thrift store. "Thought you might want something hot," she said, her voice rough but kind as she poured weak coffee into a cracked mug. She'd been an army medic once, patching up soldiers in places like the one he'd left behind, and now she patched up souls like his on these streets. Malcolm took the mug, nodding his thanks, but his gaze stayed on the fire, lost in the flickering ghosts of yesterday. Lena settled beside Malcolm on the cold ground, her knees drawn up as she sipped from her own mug. The silence between them was comfortable, forged by months of shared struggles under Detroit's unforgiving sky. She glanced at him, her sharp eyes catching the way his jaw tightened, the way his fingers gripped the mug like it was an anchor. "You're somewhere else tonight, Mac," she said softly, not pushing, just stating a fact. He didn't answer right away, just poked the fire with a stick, sending a shower of sparks into the dark. Finally he muttered, "Some places don't let you go." Lena nodded, understanding more than he'd ever told her. She'd seen her own ghosts in the faces of wounded soldiers, heard their screams in the quiet of sleepless nights. A rustle nearby broke the moment. "Eddie, old man." Sullivan shuffled over, his hands trembling from Parkinson's as he clutched a plastic bag of pill bottles. His gray beard was matted, his eyes watery, but there was a stubborn dignity in the way he carried himself. "Mac, you got a minute?" he rasped, easing down beside them with a groan. Malcolm set his mug aside and took the bag, his scarred fingers deftly sorting the medications, painkillers, muscle relaxants, the scraps of care the VA tossed to men like Eddie. "Morning dose here, evening here," he said, arranging them with the precision of a soldier organizing ammo. Eddie managed a faint smile. "Don't know what I'd do without you, brother." As Malcolm handed the sorted pills back, something slipped from his jacket pocket, a faded photograph, dog-eared and creased. It hit the ground before he could catch it, and Lena's quick hands snatched it up. Her breath caught as she stared at the image. A younger Malcolm in dress uniform, chest gleaming with medals, silver stars, a bronze star with valor, purple hearts, standing tall beside a unit in desert fatigues. "Jesus, Mac," she whispered, her voice trembling with awe and disbelief. "This is you?" Malcolm's hand froze mid-motion, his eyes snapping to hers, hard and guarded. He reached for the photo, but she held it just out of reach, searching his face. "You're no drifter. You're a damn hero." He snatched the picture back, stuffing it deep into his pocket, his voice low and rough. "That guy's dead, Lena. Let it go." But the damage was done. Her eyes burned with questions, with a sudden understanding that pierced the armor he'd built around himself. She didn't press, just watched him as he turned back to the fire, his silence heavier now. Eddie, oblivious to the tension, patted Malcolm's shoulder. "You're still saving people, Mac. That's what counts." Malcolm didn't reply, but the words lingered, stirring something restless in him. Across the city, Russo's cruelty was growing bolder, and Malcolm knew the next encounter wouldn't end with a radio call pulling the bastard away. The past might be dead, but its whispers were starting to roar. The wind howled beneath the Ambassador Bridge, a hulking steel skeleton that loomed over Detroit's underbelly, its shadow swallowing the makeshift camp of tents and tarps strung along the riverbank. Malcolm "Mac" Jackson stood at the edge of the settlement, his breath fogging in the frigid air as he watched the flickering lights of the city skyline. The camp was a fragile refuge for the forgotten, men and women huddled against the cold, their lives stitched together with salvaged blankets and whispered stories of better days. Tonight, though, the air carried a different edge, a tension that prickled the back of Malcolm's neck like the prelude to an ambush. He'd felt it before, in deserts and war zones, and he knew trouble was coming. It arrived with the screech of tires and the glare of headlights. Two patrol cars rolled to a stop at the camp's perimeter, their engines idling like growling beasts. Officer Jimmy Russo stepped out first, his blonde hair glinting under the bridge's sodium lights, his broad frame radiating menace. Derek Walsh followed, his baton already drawn, tapping it against his leg with a rhythm that promised violence. Tommy Hayes emerged last, his face pale, his eyes avoiding the camp as if he could will himself somewhere else. Russo surveyed the scene with a predator's grin, cracking his neck as he called out, "Health inspection time, folks! Let's see if this dump meets code." Laughter rumbled from Walsh, but the residents froze, their murmurs dying into a collective hush. Russo didn't wait for a response. He strode forward, kicking over a tent pole with a savage thrust of his boot. The canvas collapsed, spilling an elderly woman's belongings. Medication bottles, a cracked photo frame, a tattered shawl, into the mud. She cried out, a frail sound swallowed by Russo's mockery. "Oops, looks like you're evicted," he sneered, stomping the photo into the dirt. Walsh joined in, dragging a bearded man from another tent and shoving him to the ground, his baton cracking against the man's shoulder. "Public property, asshole," Walsh spat. "You don't belong here." The camp erupted into chaos. People scrambling to gather their things, others too stunned to move, their faces etched with fear and resignation. Malcolm stayed rooted, his hands clenched at his sides, watching as Eddie Old Man Sullivan struggled to stand from his own tarp shelter. Eddie's trembling hands fumbled with his cane, his Parkinson's making every motion a battle. Russo zeroed in on him, his grin widening. "What's this, a war hero?" he taunted, knocking the cane from Eddie's grip. The old man stumbled, falling hard against a crate, a groan escaping his lips. Malcolm moved then, stepping forward to steady Eddie, his arm firm under the veteran's frail weight. "Easy, brother," he murmured, his voice a lifeline in the storm. But his eyes lifted to Russo, and for the first time that night, they flashed with something raw. Anger restrained but burning, a ember ready to blaze. Russo's gaze snapped to Malcolm, his smirk faltering as he caught the glint of defiance in those dark, unyielding eyes. "What's that look, huh?" he barked, stepping closer, his baton raised like a club. "You got something to say, bum?" Malcolm didn't flinch, his arms still supporting Eddie as the old man clutched at him, breathing raggedly. The camp around them had fallen silent, the air thick with dread as the other residents watched, too afraid to intervene. Walsh circled to Malcolm's flank, his wiry frame tense with anticipation, while Tommy Hayes hovered near the patrol car, his hands twitching as if he might step forward but couldn't find the courage. "He's just helping the guy, Jimmy," Tommy ventured, his voice thin and uncertain. Russo ignored him, his focus locked on Malcolm, irritation boiling into something darker. "You think you're some kind of savior?" Russo snarled, jabbing the baton into Malcolm's chest, hard enough to force a step back. Malcolm absorbed the blow, his face a mask of calm, but the fire in his eyes burned brighter, a storm gathering behind the stillness. Eddie gripped his sleeve, whispering, "Don't, Mac. They'll kill you." But Russo wasn't done. He swung the baton again, this time catching Eddie's shoulder, sending the old man sprawling into the mud with a cry of pain. That was the line, the snap of a thread Malcolm had held taut for too long. He straightened, his posture shifting from prey to predator, and his voice cut through the night, low and lethal. "You'll pay for that." The words hung in the air, cold and final, a promise wrapped in steel. Russo froze, his baton mid-swing, the sneer on his face replaced by a flicker of unease. He'd expected fear, submission, anything but this quiet, unshakable threat from a man he'd dismissed as nothing. Walsh laughed nervously, breaking the tension, but it sounded forced, hollow. "What's he gonna do, Jimmy? Cry us to death?" he jeered, stepping forward to grab Malcolm's arm. In a blur, Malcolm twisted free, his movement fluid and precise, a ghost of the soldier he'd once been. He didn't strike, just stared Russo down, his silence more menacing than any shout. Russo recovered, his face flushing with rage as he lowered the baton. "You're dead, you hear me?" he hissed, but his voice cracked, betraying a sliver of doubt. The radio on his shoulder crackled again, a dispatcher's urgent call pulling him back to reality. He spat at Malcolm's feet, turning to Walsh. "Let's go. This ain't over." As they retreated to the cars, Tommy cast a final glance at Malcolm, his expression a mix of shame and awe. Malcolm knelt beside Eddie, helping him sit up, his hands gentle but his mind racing. The camp was in ruins, but something had shifted inside him. A spark of the warrior he'd buried, now smoldering, ready to ignite. Russo had crossed a line, and Malcolm knew the next move was his. The aftermath of the assault beneath the Ambassador Bridge lingered like smoke over a battlefield, the air heavy with the scent of mud and fear. Malcolm "Mac" Jackson knelt beside Eddie. Old Man Sullivan, his hands steady as he pressed a torn rag against the gash on Eddie's temple. Blood seeped through the fabric, staining Malcolm's fingers, a stark reminder of Russo's brutality. The camp lay in shambles, tents shredded, belongings scattered, the fragile sanctuary of Detroit's forgotten reduced to wreckage. Around them, residents moved like phantoms, salvaging what little they could, their faces hollow with exhaustion and defeat. Eddie's breathing was shallow, each wheeze a testament to the toll of the night, but his grip on Malcolm's arm was firm. "You shouldn't have said that, Mac," he rasped, his voice trembling. "They'll come for you now." Malcolm didn't answer, his jaw tight as he scanned the wreckage. His ribs ached from Russo's blows, his face throbbed where the baton had split his lip, and every breath sent a sharp pang through his side. He'd taken worse in war, bullet grazes, shrapnel burns, but this was different. This wasn't an enemy on a foreign field. This was a betrayal of the country he'd bled for, a wound deeper than flesh. Lena Carter emerged from the shadows, her coat splattered with mud, her eyes blazing with a mix of fury and worry. "You're hurt," she said, dropping beside him with a scavenged first aid kit. She reached for his face, but he waved her off, his focus still on Eddie. "He's worse. Patch him up first." Lena hesitated, then nodded, her medic instincts kicking in as she cleaned Eddie's wound with practiced hands. The pain was a distant hum compared to the storm raging in Malcolm's mind. Russo's words echoed, "You're dead," a threat that carried weight in a city where badges shielded monsters. He'd endured for years, swallowing the humiliation, the beatings, believing silence was his shield. But tonight, watching Eddie fall, hearing the old man's cry, something had snapped. The soldier he'd buried, the one who'd stared down death through a sniper's scope, clawed its way back, demanding action. He couldn't fight Russo with fists. The system was rigged, stacked against men like him and Eddie. But there was another way, a card he'd held close for too long. Malcolm stood, wincing, as his battered body protested and turned to Lena. "Keep him safe," he said, his voice low but resolute. She frowned, sensing the shift in him. "Where are you going?" He didn't answer, just limped toward the edge of the camp, his eyes fixed on a faint glow down Woodward Avenue. A payphone, its cracked plastic shell a relic of a fading city. Each step was agony, blood dripping from his split lip onto the pavement. But his stride grew steadier, driven by a purpose he hadn't felt since Iraq. Russo had started a war, and Malcolm was done running. The payphone on Woodward Avenue stood like a sentinel in the dark, its faint hum a lifeline amid the city's decay. Malcolm "Mac" Jackson reached it after a grueling half-hour trek, each step a battle against the pain searing through his ribs and the blood crusting on his face. His hands, sticky with Eddie's blood and his own, fumbled in his jacket pocket, pulling out a crumpled calling card he'd kept for years, a relic from a life he'd abandoned. The neon lights of a nearby liquor store flickered, casting jagged shadows as he leaned against the booth, his breath fogging the cracked glass. He punched in the number from memory, fingers trembling not from cold, but from the weight of what he was about to do, followed by a special access code etched into his mind like a scar. The line rang 3 times, each tone a hammer against his resolve, before a clipped voice answered, "Department of Defense, Special Access Line, verification required." Malcolm's voice was hoarse but steady as he recited, "November, Echo, Sierra 793, Alpha 0. A pause, then the voice confirmed, "Identity verified. How may I direct your call, Master Sergeant Jackson?" He closed his eyes, the title a ghost from a past he'd tried to bury. "General Arthur Grayson," he said. "Tell him it's Mac from Mosul." Another pause, longer this time, the silence stretching like a taut wire. Then the line clicked, and a deep, familiar voice came through, rough with shock. "Mac! Christ, I thought you were dead." Not yet, Malcolm replied, wincing as he shifted his weight, the ache in his side flaring. But some local cops are working hard to change that. Grayson's tone sharpened, the general emerging from the man. What's happened? Where are you? Malcolm took a breath, steadying himself against the flood of memories. Mosul, the ambush, the weight of Grayson on his shoulder. Detroit, he said. Corrupt officers beating veterans like dogs. Extortion, drugs, the works. They hit me tonight, nearly killed an old man I know. I've got nowhere else to turn, Art. The silence on the other end was heavy. Then Grayson spoke, his voice steel. You saved my life once, Mac. I owe you. Tell me everything. Malcolm detailed it all. Russo's brutality, Walsh's complicity, the shattered camp under the bridge. His words grew stronger, the soldier resurfacing with each syllable. They think we're nothing, Art. They're wrong. Grayson didn't hesitate. I'm handling this personally. Where can I reach you? Malcolm gave him the number of a prepaid phone stashed in his gear, along with the address of an abandoned warehouse on the riverfront. Hang tight, Grayson said, his voice now a command. This just became my fight too. As the call ended, Malcolm hung up, blood dripping onto the receiver. He lit the fuse. Russo wouldn't know what hit him. The precinct on Beaubien Street buzzed with a nervous energy, its fluorescent lights flickering like a heartbeat out of rhythm. Inside, Officer Tommy Hayes sat at his desk, his fingers hovering over the keyboard, the screen glowing with a file he wasn't supposed to access. Master Sergeant Malcolm Jackson stared back at him from the service photo. Sharp eyes, medals pinned to a crisp uniform, a man who'd once been a legend in the shadows of war. Tommy's stomach churned as he scrolled through the redacted details. 3 silver stars, a bronze star with valor, a sniper with triple-digit kills. This wasn't the broken drifter he'd watched Russo beat into the mud. This was a ghost who'd walked through hell and come out the other side. The guilt that had gnawed at him since the camp raid twisted tighter. Why hadn't he stopped it? Footsteps echoed down the hall, crisp and purposeful, pulling Tommy from his thoughts. 2 figures in dark suits strode into the precinct, their badges catching the light. FBI. Special Agent Sarah Nguyen led the way, her tailored jacket sharp against her no-nonsense demeanor, her dark hair pulled back in a tight bun. Beside her, Agent Daniel Pierce towered silently, his observant eyes scanning the room like a hawk. Conversations died as officers glanced up, a ripple of unease spreading through the bullpen. Nguyen approached the front desk, her voice cutting through the murmur. We need to see Captain O'Malley. Now. The desk sergeant hesitated, then buzzed the captain, his hands shaky. Tommy's pulse quickened. He knew this wasn't about some random case. This was about Russo. Minutes later, Nguyen and Pierce sat across from Captain O'Malley in his cluttered office, the air thick with tension. The captain, a barrel-chested man with graying hair and a permanent scowl, leaned back in his chair, forcing a smile. What brings the feds to Detroit? He asked, his tone too casual. Nguyen didn't blink. Civil rights violations, complaints of excessive force against homeless veterans in your precinct. O'Malley's smile faltered, his fingers drumming on the desk. Must be a misunderstanding. My officers follow protocol. Pierce spoke for the first time, his voice flat. We're here to find out. As the agents pressed him, Tommy slipped out of the bullpen, his mind racing. He'd seen Russo's brutality firsthand, Eddie's blood, Malcolm's defiance. He couldn't stay silent anymore. Across town, beneath the Ambassador Bridge, Malcolm crouched by Eddie's side, wrapping a makeshift bandage around the old man's shoulder. The camp was quieter now, the survivors licking their wounds, but the air hummed with a new danger. Russo wouldn't let that threat. You'll pay for that. Slide. Malcolm knew it, felt it in his bones. Lena watched him, her eyes sharp with worry. You stirred the hive, Mac, she said, handing him a rag to wipe the blood from his hands. He nodded, his gaze distant, fixed on the city's jagged skyline. The call to Grayson had set things in motion, but Russo was a rabid dog, cornered and ready to bite. The night deepened over Detroit, the neon haze swallowed by a creeping fog that rolled off the river. Malcolm "Mac" Jackson moved through the camp with a soldier's grace, his battered body protesting but his resolve unshaken. He'd sent Lena to check on the others, leaving him alone with Eddie, whose ragged breathing filled the silence. The old man's eyes fluttered open, meeting Malcolm's. "You're crazy, taking on Russo like that," he muttered, a faint smile tugging at his lips. Malcolm didn't reply, just adjusted the blanket over Eddie's frail frame. Crazy or not, he'd drawn a line in the mud, and Russo was coming to erase it. Headlights sliced through the fog, tires crunching gravel as a patrol car screeched to a halt at the camp's edge. Malcolm tensed, his hand instinctively dropping to his side where a rifle once hung. Russo stepped out, alone this time, his blonde hair glinting under the bridge lights, his face twisted with fury. "You," he snarled, striding forward, baton in hand. "Thought you could mouth off and walk away?" Malcolm rose, stepping in front of Eddie, his stance deceptively relaxed. The camp's residents shrank back, but their eyes stayed on him, a flicker of hope amid the fear. Russo stopped a few feet away, his chest heaving. "You're nothing, you hear me? Nothing." Before Russo could swing, Malcolm moved, fast, fluid, a blur of muscle memory from years of combat. He sidestepped the baton, grabbed Russo's wrist, and twisted hard, forcing the weapon to clatter into the mud. Russo roared, swinging a wild fist, but Malcolm ducked, driving an elbow into the officer's gut. Russo doubled over, gasping, his eyes wide with shock as he stumbled back. For a moment, the world shrank to just the two of them. Predator and prey reversed. Malcolm didn't press the attack. He stepped back, his breathing steady, his voice ice cold. "Walk away, Russo. Last chance." Russo straightened, spitting blood, his rage now laced with something new. Fear. The standoff broke as more headlights pierced the night, FBI vehicles, their engines growling as they surrounded the camp. Agents poured out, weapons drawn, led by Sarah Nguyen, her badge flashing in the chaos. "Stand down, Officer Russo," she shouted, her voice cutting through the fog. Russo froze, his hands trembling, caught between fight and flight. Malcolm stepped aside, his eyes never leaving Russo as the agents closed in. Nguyen glanced at him, a nod of recognition passing between them. Russo cursed, backing toward his car, but the net was tightening. Across town, Tommy Hayes slipped a burner phone from his pocket, dialing the number Nguyen had left him. "I'm in," he whispered, his voice firm at last. Malcolm had lit the spark, and now the fire was spreading. Russo's reckoning was near. The dawn broke over Detroit with a cold, gray light, the city stirring beneath a sky heavy with the promise of snow. At a private airstrip just outside the city limits, a military transport touched down, its engines roaring as it taxied to a halt. General Arthur Grayson stepped onto the tarmac, his civilian overcoat doing little to hide the commanding presence of a four-star general. His weathered face was set in a grim line, his steel gray eyes scanning the horizon where the skyline of Detroit loomed like a jagged wound. He'd come for Malcolm "Mac" Jackson, the man who dragged him out of hell in Mosul, and he'd brought the full weight of his authority with him. A black SUV waited, and he climbed in, barking orders to the driver. "Get me to Selfridge Air Base, now." At the base, Malcolm sat in a sterile medical bay, his bruised torso wrapped in fresh bandages, an IV dripping into his arm. The doctors had confirmed 3 cracked ribs, a split lip, and a kidney contusion, souvenirs from Russo's baton. But his eyes burned with a clarity that pain couldn't dull. Lena Carter hovered nearby, her arms crossed, watching as a medic adjusted the drip. "You look like hell, Mac," she said, her voice rough with worry. He managed a faint smirk, wincing as he shifted. "Feel like it too." The door swung open, and Grayson strode in, his presence filling the room like a storm rolling in. Lena stepped back, startled, but Malcolm met his old commander's gaze, a flicker of recognition passing between them. "Art," he said simply, his voice steady despite the strain. Grayson pulled up a chair, his expression softening for a moment before hardening again. "You should have called sooner, Mac. What the hell happened out there?" Malcolm recounted the night under the bridge, Russo's rampage, Eddie's blood, the threat that had finally broken his silence. Grayson listened, his jaw tightening with each word, the soldier in him bristling at the betrayal of honor. "I've got a team on it," he said when Malcolm finished. Military intelligence is tracking Russo and Walsh. The FBI is already in play, but this is personal now. Malcolm nodded, his hands clenching the edge of the cot. They've been terrorizing vets for years, Art. It's bigger than me. Across town at the precinct on Beaubien Street, Tommy Hayes slipped into an empty break room, his heart pounding as he dialed the burner phone Special Agent Sarah Nguyen had given him. "It's Hayes," he said, his voice low but firm. "I've got names, dates. Everything on Russo's operation." Nguyen's reply was crisp. "Good. Meet us at the Federal Building in an hour. You're doing the right thing, officer." Tommy hung up, his hands trembling, but his resolve solidifying. He'd watched Russo shatter lives too long. Malcolm's stand had lit a fire in him he couldn't ignore. The web was closing, and he was ready to pull the strings. The hum of machinery filled the air at Selfridge Air Base as General Grayson paced the medical bay, his boots clicking against the tile. Malcolm "Mac" Jackson watched him, the IV line tugging at his arm with each subtle shift. Grayson stopped, turning to face him, his voice low but fierce. "Russo's not just a thug, Mac. He's got connections, dealers, city officials, a whole damn network. I'm bringing in Colonel Reese and a surveillance unit. We'll bury him." Malcolm's eyes narrowed, the soldier in him stirring at the promise of justice. "He's got to know it's coming," he said. "He'll hit back hard." Grayson nodded, a grim smile tugging at his lips. "Let him try. He's not fighting a drifter this time. He's fighting us." Outside Detroit, in a rundown motel off I-94, Jimmy Russo slammed his fist into a chipped table, the wood splintering under the blow. His blonde hair was disheveled, his uniform swapped for a leather jacket, but the fury in his eyes burned brighter than ever. Derek Walsh paced nearby, his wiry frame jittery, a half-empty beer bottle in his hand. "Feds were at the precinct, Jimmy," he said, his voice tight. "They're asking about the camp, the vets, everything." Russo spun on him, his face a mask of rage. "That bastard Jackson did this. Thinks he can call in favors and take me down." He grabbed his service pistol from the bed, checking the clip with a savage snap. "He's dead. I'll make sure of it." The motel's thin walls did little to muffle the roar of a car engine as Russo's plan took shape. He'd gotten word of Malcolm's location, a tip from a dirty cop still loyal to him, whispering about a military base. "Selfridge," Russo muttered, a plan forming in his twisted mind. "I'll hit him where he thinks he's safe." Walsh hesitated, his bravado faltering. "Jimmy, if the feds are involved, maybe we should lay low." Russo cut him off, grabbing Walsh by the collar and shoving him against the wall. "You're either with me or you're next," he snarled. Walsh nodded, fear swallowing his doubts. They were in too deep to turn back now. Back at the base, Lena slipped into the medical bay, her face pale as she approached Malcolm. "Word's spreading, Mac." "Russo's losing it. People saw him tearing out of the precinct like a madman." Malcolm's jaw tightened, his mind racing. He'd expected retaliation, but not this fast. Grayson overheard, stepping closer, his voice a low growl. "He's walking into a trap. Reese's team is already in position. Cameras, drones, the works. If he comes for you, he's done." Malcolm met his gaze, a cold resolve settling over him. "He won't stop, Art. Not until one of us is in the ground." The room fell silent, the weight of the coming storm pressing down. Russo's desperation was a lit fuse, and Malcolm knew the explosion was hours away. The night air outside Selfridge Air Base was thick with tension, the distant hum of Detroit swallowed by the whine of military drones circling overhead. Inside the medical bay, Malcolm "Mac" Jackson sat upright on his cot, the IV removed, his bruised face set in a mask of quiet determination. General Arthur "Art" Grayson stood by the window, his silhouette rigid against the floodlights outside, barking orders into a secure phone. "Reese, lock it down. Full perimeter sweep. He's coming." The trap was set, a web of surveillance and firepower woven by military intelligence. But Malcolm knew Russo too well. Rage made men reckless, and reckless men didn't see the jaws closing around them. The roar of an engine shattered the stillness, a black sedan screeching onto the base's outer road, its headlights slicing through the dark. Jimmy Russo leapt out, his leather jacket slick with sweat, his pistol drawn as he stormed toward the gate. He'd come alone, Walsh's nerve having crumbled back at the motel, leaving Russo to face his vendetta solo. "Jackson!" he bellowed, his voice raw with fury, firing a wild shot into the air. "Get out here, you coward!" Before he could take another step, floodlights snapped on, blinding him as a dozen FBI agents swarmed from the shadows, rifles trained on his chest. Special Agent Sarah Nguyen stepped forward, her badge gleaming, her voice steady. "Drop it, Russo, you're done." He froze, his gun trembling in his hand, eyes darting like a trapped animal's. For a moment it seemed he'd fight. Then the weight of the odds crashed down, and the pistol clattered to the pavement. Agents tackled him, cuffing his wrists as he spat curses, his blonde hair matted with dirt. Inside, Malcolm watched through the window, his fists clenched, a flicker of satisfaction cutting through the pain. Grayson turned to him, his voice low. "That's step one. The rest falls now." Across town, Derek Walsh sat in an FBI van, his head in his hands, spilling names and dates to avoid the fate Russo had rushed toward. Captain O'Malley was next, his office raided as agents carted out files linking him to Councilwoman Evelyn Torres. Lena slipped into the bay, her eyes wide as she relayed the news trickling in from the streets. "They got him, Mac. It's all over the radio. Russo's finished." Malcolm nodded, but his gaze stayed distant, replaying the moment Russo's gun hit the ground. Grayson hung up his phone, his expression darkening. "There's more to this, Mac." Reese dug into Russo's file. His father was Staff Sergeant Daniel Russo, KIA in Iraq under my command. Malcolm's head snapped up, the pieces clicking into place. "He blames you," he said quietly, "and every vet he saw on the street." Grayson's jaw tightened, guilt shadowing his eyes. "Explains the hate, doesn't excuse it." The truth was out, and it cut deeper than any baton. The precinct on Beaubien Street descended into chaos as news of Russo's arrest rippled through the city like a shockwave. Officers huddled in clusters, whispering about the FBI's raid, their voices drowned by the clamor of ringing phones and slamming doors. Tommy Hayes stood in the federal building downtown, his uniform traded for a plain jacket, his testimony spilling out to Special Agent Sarah Nguyen and a stone-faced prosecutor. Russo ran it all. Protection rackets, payoffs from dealers like Marcus. O'Malley took a cut to keep it quiet, he said, his voice steady despite the sweat beading on his brow. Nguyen nodded, scribbling notes, her eyes sharp with purpose. "And the veterans?" she pressed. Tommy swallowed hard. "Russo hated them, called them failures. I should have stopped him." His confession was a lifeline, tying the noose tighter around Russo's neck. Back at Selfridge, Malcolm "Mac" Jackson stood by the window, the base's floodlights casting long shadows across his battered frame. General Grayson paced behind him, his phone buzzing with updates from Colonel Reese. "Walsh is singing. Implicated Torres in a land grab scheme. They wanted the riverfront cleared for condos," Grayson said, his voice thick with disgust. Malcolm turned, his eyes narrowing. "That's why they hit the camp so hard. It wasn't just cruelty. It was business." The revelation twisted the knife deeper, turning Russo's brutality into something colder, more calculated. Lena watched from the corner, her fists clenched. "Bastards," she muttered, her medic's compassion warring with her street-hardened rage. The first news vans arrived outside the base gates within the hour, their cameras flashing as reporters shouted questions into the night. "Decorated veteran exposes police corruption," blared the headlines on crackling radios. Malcolm's service photo, a younger, prouder version of him, plastered across screens. He flinched at the sound of his name, the weight of unwanted fame settling on his shoulders. Grayson clapped a hand on his back, his grip firm. "They're making you a symbol, Mac. Can't stop that now." Malcolm's lips pressed into a thin line, his voice barely audible. "I didn't want this." But the world didn't care. The story was too big, too raw, a spark igniting a firestorm of outrage across Detroit. Grayson's phone rang again, Reese's voice cutting through static. "We've got chatter. Russo's crew is scrambling, but he's not done fighting. He's screaming about you and holding Mac." Malcolm's gaze hardened, the soldier in him waking fully now. "Let him scream," he said, his tone icy. "He's got nothing left." Grayson nodded, but his eyes held a flicker of concern. Russo's hatred ran deep, rooted in a past neither of them could erase. As the media frenzy grew, Malcolm knew the battle wasn't over. The arrest was just the beginning. The courtroom loomed ahead, where truth would face its final test. Russo's fall was certain, but the cost of dragging him down was still unfolding, a shadow stretching toward the light. The federal courthouse in Detroit thrummed with a restless pulse, its marble halls echoing with the clamor of footsteps and hushed voices as the city held its breath. Outside, a bitter wind whipped through the streets, rattling the protest signs. "Justice for veterans!" clutched by a growing crowd. Inside, the courtroom was a cauldron of tension, the air thick with the scent of polished wood and nervous sweat. Malcolm "Mac" Jackson sat in the witness box, his broad shoulders squared despite the ache of healing ribs, his dark eyes fixed on a point beyond the judge's bench. He wore a borrowed suit, stiff and unfamiliar, a far cry from the ragged jacket he'd lived in for years. Across the room, Jimmy Russo sat shackled in an orange jumpsuit, his blonde hair greasy, his face a storm of rage and ruin. Their gazes clashed, a silent detonation of past and present, before Malcolm looked away, steeling himself for what was to come. Special Agent Sarah Nguyen stood before the prosecution, her voice a blade slicing through the murmurs. "James Russo didn't just break the law. He shattered lives," she declared, her words sharp as she pointed to a blown-up photo of the Ambassador Bridge camp, its tents torn apart like battlefield wreckage. "He targeted veterans, men and women who fought for this country, because he thought they were powerless. He was wrong." The jury leaned forward, their faces tightening as she unveiled the evidence. Bank records of payoffs from Marcus, audio of Russo laughing as he beat a homeless man, a ledger linking him to Councilwoman Torres's riverfront scheme. Russo's lawyer scribbled notes, his polished facade cracking, but Russo himself sat rigid, his fists clenched until his knuckles whitened, a volcano on the edge of eruption. When Malcolm rose to testify, the room fell silent, the weight of his presence commanding every eye. He spoke low and deliberate, each word a hammer strike. "I watched him kick Eddie Sullivan into the mud, an old man who served in Vietnam, because he could. I watched him smash tents, burn belongings, laugh while people begged." His voice trembled, not with fear, but with a fury he'd held back too long. "He called us nothing. He was wrong about that, too." A juror wiped her eyes, another clenched his jaw, the raw pain in Malcolm's testimony cutting through the sterile courtroom air. Russo surged forward, chains rattling, his voice a snarl. "You lying bastard! You think you're a hero?" The judge's gavel slammed, but the outburst hung there, a crack in Russo's armor exposing the desperation beneath. The defense scrambled, claiming Russo was a pawn of a corrupt system, but their words drowned in the tide of evidence. Malcolm stepped down, his gaze locking with Russo's once more, and in that moment, something shifted, a flicker of recognition, a buried truth clawing free. Russo's rage wasn't just arrogance, it was personal, a wound Malcolm hadn't yet named. The trial was a crucible, and the heat was rising. Derek Walsh took the stand next, his wiry frame hunched, his dark brown hair plastered with sweat as he faced the courtroom's glare. His plea deal hung like a lifeline, and he seized it, his voice shaking but resolute. Russo planned it all, the protection rackets, the beatings. But the riverfront? That was bigger. He had a deal with Torres to move drugs through the construction sites hidden in the materials. The gallery gasped, a ripple of shock spreading as Nguyen slid a stack of shipping manifests across the table. Proof of heroin stashed in cement bags, a fortune masked as urban renewal. Russo's lawyer leapt up, objecting, but the judge's stern overruled silenced him. Walsh glanced at Russo, fear flashing in his eyes, then pressed on. "He hated the vets most, said they didn't deserve to live when his dad didn't." The words landed like a grenade, and Malcolm's head snapped up, his mind racing back to Grayson's revelation. Russo's father, killed under the general's command. The pieces locked into place, every kick, every sneer, a twisted vengeance against men like Malcolm, shadows of a war Russo never fought. The jury scribbled notes, their faces hardening, while reporters whispered into recorders, the story exploding beyond the courtroom walls. Russo lunged again, chains clanking, his voice a raw howl. "Shut up, you rat! "You don't know shit about my dad." Bailiffs wrestled him back, but his outburst only deepened the hole he dug, his hatred laid bare for all to see. The prosecution rested, and the defense's flimsy rebuttal, Russo as a misguided cog in a corrupt machine, crumbled under the weight of evidence. Hours later, the jury returned, their verdict swift and unanimous. Guilty on all counts, civil rights violations, racketeering, assault. The gavel fell, a thunderclap sealing Russo's fate, and he slumped, his defiance draining into a hollow stare. Malcolm watched, his chest tight, not with triumph, but with a weary relief. As Russo was led away, he turned, locking eyes with Malcolm one last time, his voice a venomous whisper. "This ain't over, Jackson. Not for you." The threat lingered, a dark promise from a man with nothing left to lose. Outside, the courthouse steps erupted as news crews swarmed, their lights blinding in the dusk. General Grayson emerged, his voice booming over the chaos. "Today proves no one's above the law, not even those who hide behind a badge." Protesters cheered, signs waving, but Malcolm slipped away, avoiding the cameras, his borrowed suit jacket pulled tight. Lena caught up to him, her eyes bright with pride. "You did it, Mac. They're listening now." He nodded, but his gaze drifted to the skyline, where the Ambassador Bridge loomed. The trial had ended Russo's reign, but its echoes were just beginning. Justice had a price, and Detroit was about to feel its weight. The sun rose over Detroit with a hesitant glow, its rays filtering through the smog to touch a city transformed by the echoes of a gavel's fall. The trial of Jimmy Russo had cracked open a wound long festering, and in its wake, the streets hummed with a cautious hope. Beneath the Ambassador Bridge, the camp that once lay in ruins now buzzed with activity. Volunteers hammered nails into fresh plywood, erecting temporary shelters funded by a flood of donations sparked by Malcolm Mac Jackson's story. The air carried the scent of sawdust and coffee instead of mud and despair, a fragile rebirth for those Russo had crushed. Malcolm stood at the edge of the site, his hands in the pockets of a new coat, watching as Eddie Old Man Sullivan directed a young vet to a cot, his trembling hands steadier with purpose. The news had spread like wildfire. Headlines screamed, "Hero vet topples corrupt cop," plastering Malcolm's service photo across every screen and paper. Protests outside City Hall had morphed into rallies, their chants demanding homes, not harassment, for veterans. Councilwoman Torres's arrest had toppled the riverfront condo scheme, and seized assets were redirected to the VA, funding beds, counselors, and clinics. Malcolm felt the weight of it all, an unwanted spotlight that burned hotter than the desert sun he'd once endured. General Arthur Grayson had offered him reinstatement, full rank, full honors, but Malcolm had turned it down, his voice quiet but firm. "My fight's here now, Art. These people need me more than the Army does." Lena Carter approached, her medic's bag slung over her shoulder, a rare smile breaking through her usual grit. "They gave me a job, Mac, via outreach coordinator. Said my field experience made me a fit." She punched his arm lightly, pride in her eyes. "Guess you're rubbing off on me." Malcolm nodded, a flicker of warmth cutting through his guarded demeanor. "You'll do more good than I ever could," he said, watching as she knelt to check Eddie's bandages, her hands deft and sure. The camp wasn't just rebuilding, it was healing, a testament to the ripple of one man's stand. Across town, Tommy Hayes faced a review board at the precinct, his badge on the line, but his conscience clear. "I failed them once," he told the panel, his voice steady. "Not again." The precinct itself was shifting. Captain O'Malley's office stood empty, his nameplate gone, replaced by a new commander vowing reform. Tommy's testimony had spared him jail, earning him a demotion but a new role, liaison to the homeless community, a chance to rebuild trust he'd once betrayed. Malcolm watched it all from a distance, the city's scars still visible, but softening under a tide of change. Russo's fall had lit a spark, but the fire was theirs to tend now, a fragile light pushing back the shadow he'd cast for too long. The afternoon sun hung low over Detroit, casting long shadows across the revitalized camp beneath the Ambassador Bridge. Malcolm Mac Jackson walked among the new shelters, his boots crunching on fresh gravel laid by volunteers. The chatter of residents filled the air, veterans swapping stories, some laughing for the first time in years, their faces lit with a cautious optimism Malcolm hadn't seen before. He stopped by a folding table where a VA worker handed out housing vouchers, her clipboard stacked with forms bearing names he recognized. Men and women he'd shared fires with, now stepping toward a future Russo had tried to steal. Eddie Old Man Sullivan shuffled over, his cane tapping the ground, a grin splitting his weathered face. "Got a room lined up, Mac. First bed in a decade, that ain't the dirt." Malcolm clasped his shoulder, a rare smile tugging at his lips. "You earned it, brother." But the change wasn't just in the camp. It was in the city's pulse. News vans cruised the streets, their cameras hungry for updates, while billboards flickered with PSAs. Support our vets, end the silence. The riverfront, once slated for condos, now bore signs for a veterans housing project, its groundbreaking set for spring. Lena returned from her rounds, her bag lighter, her step brisk. "They're naming a clinic after you, Mac. Jackson House. Like it or not, you're a damn icon now." He scowled, shaking his head. "I didn't ask for that." She laughed, a sound that cut through his gruff exterior. "Too bad. You're stuck with it." Her new role at the VA had ignited something in her, a fire Malcolm recognized, the same one driving him to stay. An unexpected visitor broke the moment. Tommy Hayes, his uniform traded for a plain jacket, a badge still pinned to his chest but tarnished by his past. He approached Malcolm, his hands shoved deep in his pockets, his eyes shadowed with guilt. "They kept me on," he said, voice low. "Liaison gig. Figured I owed you that much." Malcolm studied him, the rookie who'd once turned away now standing taller, his shame forging something new. "You owe them," Malcolm replied, nodding toward the camp. "Make it right." Tommy nodded, a silent vow passing between them, a bridge built from the ashes of betrayal. As dust settled, Malcolm stood alone by the riverbank, the water reflecting the city's jagged glow. The trial had ended Russo's reign, but its echoes were reshaping Detroit, shelters rising, voices heard, a community clawing back from the edge. Yet a shadow lingered in his mind. Russo's final glare, his whispered threat. "This ain't over." General Grayson had warned him Russo was still raging in his cell, a caged beast plotting from the dark. Malcolm's hand brushed the prepaid phone in his pocket, a lifeline to the past and the fight ahead. The light was winning, but he knew Russo's hate ran deep, a storm brewing that would demand one last reckoning. The Michigan State Prison loomed on the outskirts of Detroit, a gray fortress of concrete and steel squatting beneath a sky bruised with storm clouds. Malcolm "Mac" Jackson stepped through the security gate, his borrowed jacket heavy on his shoulders, the weight of the past pressing harder with each echoing clang of metal doors. He'd come at Russo's request. A scrawled note passed through a guard, its words terse. "Need to see you. One last time." Against General Grayson's advice, against Lena's pleas, Malcolm had agreed, driven by a need he couldn't name, to face the man who'd haunted his nights, to close a chapter that refused to end. The guard led him to a visitation room, its fluorescent lights harsh against the chip table where Russo waited, shackled and diminished. Jimmy Russo looked like a shadow of the brute who'd terrorized the Ambassador Bridge camp. Prison had carved him hollow, his blonde hair thinning, his broad frame slumped, his eyes bloodshot but still burning with a flicker of the old hate. He didn't rise as Malcolm sat across from him, the silence stretching thin and taut between them, a wire ready to snap. "Didn't think you'd show," Russo rasped, his voice rough from disuse, his chained hands twitching on the table. Malcolm leaned back, his face unreadable, his voice low. "You asked, I'm here. Say what you got to say." Russo's lip curled, a ghost of his old smirk, but it faded fast, replaced by something raw, something broken. "I've had time to think," Russo began, his gaze dropping to the table, tracing the scratches with a shaky finger. "About my dad, about what I did." Malcolm's jaw tightened. The memory of Grayson's words, Staff Sergeant Daniel Russo, KIA in Iraq, stirring in his mind. He stayed silent, letting Russo unravel. "He was a soldier, like you. Died following orders from your damn general. Came home in a box while you all got medals and parades. His voice cracked, bitterness bleeding through. But then it softened, a tremor Malcolm hadn't expected. I told myself I was honoring him, punishing the ones who came back when he didn't. The vets, the bums, you. He looked up, his eyes meeting Malcolm's, and for the first time, there was no rage, just a hollow ache. Malcolm leaned forward, his voice steady but edged with steel. Your dad died a hero, Russo. Saved lives, including Grayson's. You didn't honor him. You spat on everything he stood for. Russo flinched, the words cutting deeper than any baton he'd ever swung. He rubbed his face, chains clinking, and nodded slowly, as if the truth had finally sunk through the cracks of his denial. I know that now, he whispered, his voice barely audible. I screwed it all up, Jackson. Everything. The confession hung there, fragile and heavy, a bridge neither had expected to cross. Malcolm Mack, Jackson sat back, the weight of Russo's words settling into the silence of the visitation room like dust after a storm. The harsh lights buzzed overhead, casting stark shadows across Jimmy Russo's face, once a mask of arrogance, now a canvas of regret. Russo's hands trembled, the chains rattling softly as he stared at the table, his confession still echoing. I don't expect forgiveness, he said, his voice rough but steady now, stripped of its old venom. Ain't asking for it. Just needed you to know, I get it now. What I did to you, to Eddie, to all of them, it was wrong, worse than wrong. Malcolm's eyes narrowed, searching for a lie, a trick, but found only a man unmoored, adrift in the wreckage he'd made. You turned your pain into a weapon, Malcolm said, his tone low, measured, cutting through the quiet. Your dad fought for something. You fought against it. Russo nodded, a single jerky motion, his throat working as if swallowing glass. I saw him in you, every vet I beat down. Thought I was evening the score, but I was just lost. He paused, then met Malcolm's gaze, a flicker of desperation breaking through. Tell me something, Jackson. Was it worth it? Coming back? Surviving just to end up like this? The question hung heavy, a mirror to Malcolm's own ghosts. Years of war, years of streets, a life teetering between purpose and oblivion. Malcolm leaned forward, his scarred hands flat on the table, his voice firm but not cruel. I came back broken, yeah, but I didn't let it turn me into you. That's the difference. Russo's shoulders slumped, the last of his defiance crumbling, and for a moment, Malcolm saw not the monster who'd beaten him bloody, but a man drowning in a grief he'd never faced. I'm sorry, Russo whispered, the words barely audible, a crack in the armor he'd worn too long. Not that it fixes anything. Malcolm didn't respond, didn't offer absolution. Just watched as Russo buried his face in his hands, the chains a stark reminder of the cage he'd built for himself. The guard signaled time, and Malcolm rose, his boots scuffing the floor. Russo looked up, his voice halting. The vets out there, Eddie, the others, they getting help now? Malcolm nodded, a flicker of something softer in his eyes. Yeah. Shelters, clinics, a chance. Because of what happened, Russo exhaled, a ragged sound, a ghost of relief crossing his face. Good. That's, good. Malcolm turned to leave, but Russo's voice stopped him at the door. Jackson, I'm done fighting. The words lingered as Malcolm stepped out, the clang of the lock behind him a punctuation to a war finally ending. Outside, the storm broke, rain washing the prison walls, and Malcolm felt a weight lift. Not forgiveness, but understanding, a quiet peace that would carry him into the dawn. Spring crept into Detroit with a tentative warmth, the chill of winter giving way to budding green along the riverbank beneath the Ambassador Bridge. The camp that had once been a battleground now stood transformed, a cluster of sturdy shelters, their walls painted with murals of hope by local artists, a testament to a city reborn from its ashes. Malcolm Mack Jackson walked the gravel paths, his new boots scuffing the ground, his hands free of the blood and grime that had defined him for so long. The air carried the sound of hammers and laughter, veterans moving with purpose as they built not just homes but lives. Eddie Old Man Sullivan sat on a bench nearby, his cane resting beside him, watching a young vet, barely 20, carry a stack of blankets to a new resident. "Looks like you started something, Mac," Eddie said, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. The city had changed in the months since Russo's trial, its scars softening under a tide of action. The Riverfront Housing Project broke ground last week, its first units reserved for veterans, funded by the wreckage of Torres's corruption. Shelters like this one bore plaques, simple words etched in bronze, "For those who served, never forgotten." Lena Carter, now a fixture at the VA, strode past with a clipboard, her medic's bag traded for a radio buzzing with updates. 30 more beds by June, she called to Malcolm, her grin fierce. "You're stuck being a hero, like it or not." He shook his head, but the corners of his mouth lifted, a rare, unguarded smile. The spotlight had dimmed, but its light had sparked a movement, drawing volunteers, donors, and a new mayor who'd campaigned on reform. Tommy Hayes approached, his liaison badge gleaming, his posture straighter than the rookie who'd once faltered. "Just got word. Precinct's training new recruits on community outreach. No more turning a blind eye," he said, his voice carrying a quiet pride. Malcolm nodded, the bridge between them solid now, forged in the fire of accountability. "Keep it honest," he replied, his tone a command softened by respect. Tommy tipped his head, then moved off to help a vet with a benefits form, his hands steady where they'd once trembled. The cycle of compassion rippled outward, veterans helping veterans, a legacy Malcolm hadn't sought but couldn't deny. General Arthur Grayson's SUV rolled up, dust swirling as he stepped out, his civilian coat crisp despite the miles he'd traveled for this farewell. "Heading overseas tomorrow," he said, his steel gray eyes sweeping the camp. "Wanted to see this first." He handed Malcolm a folder, his reinstatement papers, still unsigned. "Last chance, Mac." Malcolm took it, then set it on the bench, untouched. "I'm home here, Art. This is my mission now." Grayson nodded, a flicker of pride breaking his stern facade. The camp glowed in the fading light, a beacon of what could be, but Malcolm's thoughts drifted to Russo's cell, to the rain-washed peace of their last meeting, a quiet that demanded one final act. The sun dipped below Detroit's skyline, painting the Ambassador Bridge in hues of fire and gold as Malcolm, Mac Jackson, stood by the river's edge, the camp's murmurs fading into the evening hush. General Grayson lingered beside him, his gaze tracing the shelters, the people, the life Malcolm had fought to reclaim. "You've done more here than I ever saw in combat," Grayson said, his voice rough with something like awe. He clapped Malcolm's shoulder, then turned to his SUV, pausing at the door. "No man left behind, Mac. You kept that promise." The engine roared to life, and he was gone, leaving Malcolm with the folder on the bench, a past he'd let go, and a future he was still shaping. As dusk deepened, Lena approached, her clipboard tucked under her arm, her eyes catching the light. "Found something today," she said, pulling a yellowed envelope from her bag. "Came up in Russo's old precinct files. Letter from his dad, never mailed." Malcolm took it, his fingers brushing the brittle paper, the name Daniel Russo scrawled in a soldier's steady hand. He opened it, the words spilling out like a ghost whisper. "Jimmy, if I don't make it, protect the weak. That's what this uniform means. Be better than me." The irony twisted in Malcolm's chest. Daniel's hope drowned by his son's hate, a plea lost until this moment. Lena watched him, quiet as the weight of it sank in. "He never knew," she murmured. Malcolm nodded, the letter trembling slightly in his grip, a final thread tying him to Russo's ruin. He could have burned it, let it fade like the embers of his old fires, but something else stirred, a purpose beyond survival, beyond justice. "I'm writing it down," he said, his voice firm, a decision breaking through the quiet. "All of it. Eddie, the camp, Russo, this letter. Not for me, for them." He gestured to the camp, the veterans moving in the twilight, their stories untold until now. Lena's eyes widened, then softened. "A book?" she asked. "Yeah," he replied. "So no one forgets what they went through, what we went through." It wasn't fame he sought, but memory, a record to honor the invisible, to ensure their flame endured. Malcolm walked to the barrel fire where it all began, its glow a mirror to that first night of defiance. A young vet helped Eddie to a chair, their laughter mingling with the crackle of flames, a cycle unbroken. He slipped the letter into his pocket, a burden and a gift, and sat alone as stars pierced the sky. The city stretched before him, flawed but fighting, its neon lights no longer hiding shadows, but illuminating scars that healed. Malcolm exhaled, the soldier at peace, the drifter home. His story would live on, not in medals or headlines, but in the quiet strength of those he'd lifted, a flame that no darkness could extinguish.